and exhausted. The 1,920 seconds in Paris are often remembered for their brilliance. The cafes of Montparnasse, filled with artists and poets, the jazz spilling from smoky basements, the flappers dancing in sequin dresses. But beneath that glittering surface lay something quieter and far more ordinary. The struggle of daily life in a city that had become the symbol of modernity. For women, especially, this struggle was not just about art or beauty. It was about survival, independence, and the slow reshaping of identity in a world that had been torn apart. The heroine craze, as journalists later called it, was more than a fascination with women who lived boldly. It was an obsession with female figures who represented a kind of fragile rebellion. Artists, writers, and models who seemed to exist between tragedy and liberation. The term heroine was borrowed from literature, but in 1,920 seconds, Paris, it meant something slightly different. These women weren't necessarily heroes in the traditional sense. They were often dreamers, wanderers, or muses. Women who rejected ordinary life, or were rejected by it. In Montparnasse, where cafes like La Rotonde and Le Dôme never seemed to close, young women came from every corner of Europe, with nothing but a small suitcase and a head full of ideas. Many of them were aspiring painters or dancers. Others were simply running from the constraints of home. They found rooms in drafty pensions, surviving on black coffee, baguettes, and the occasional café crème. The myth of freedom in Paris drew them in, but the reality was far more mundane. There were laundry lines that froze in the courtyard, coal shortages that turned apartments into iceboxes, and the endless ache of trying to create something meaningful while one's stomach growled. Imagine waking up in one of those rooms. The window is frosted over, and the air smells faintly of kerosene from the small heater sputtering in the corner. You pull on layers of clothing stockings that never quite dry, a skirt mended too many times, and step out into the fog. The street is alive with carriages, trams, and men in long coats. You walk toward the cafe, where warmth and conversation might make up for the lack of breakfast. It is there, among the cluttered tables, that the heroines of 1,920 seconds Paris came to life. There was Kiki de Montparnasse, who became the muse of Man Ray and the symbol of bohemian Paris. There was Nancy Cunard, the wealthy heiress turned poet and activist, who rejected her family's fortune to live among artists. There was Juna Barnes, the American writer who recorded it all in quiet, melancholy prose. Each of them lived differently, yet they all shared the same defiant energy, a refusal to be ordinary. But for every Kiki, there were hundreds of nameless women who shared the same streets and the same winters, but not the same fame. They worked as seamstresses, typists, or nannies. They copied the style of the heroines, the short bobbed hair, the long scarves, but their rebellion was quieter. It was in the way they chose not to marry too early, or how they spent their wages on books instead of new shoes. Their lives rarely made it into photographs or memoirs, but they were the real backbone of this new Paris. The winters of Paris were particularly cruel for these women. The city's infrastructure was still struggling from wartime neglect. Fuel was scarce, and so were jobs. In many boarding houses, residents took turns sharing small coal stoves, and when the supply ran out, they would simply go to bed early to conserve warmth. A popular saying of the time was, "Sleep instead of supper." Yet even in the cold, the city pulsed with life. The cafes stayed open, filled with artists, debating art and politics in thick cigarette smoke. The women listened quietly, sometimes sketching in notebooks or typing manuscripts on borrowed machines. They were learning to occupy public space, a radical idea for the time. Before the war, women had been confined mostly to domestic roles, but by the early 1,920 seconds, the cafes had become their classrooms, their studios, and their stages. It was not uncommon to see women alone in cafes, something that had once been considered scandalous. They ordered absinthe or wine without apology. Some of them wrote letters home, pretending that they were fine. Others worked on poems or essays that would never be published. The line between poverty and art was thin, almost invisible, but there was a dignity in that shared struggle. One memoir from the period, written by a young woman named Suzanne Desprez, described the winters as a time of silence and survival. She wrote, "The men speak loudly, the artists paint with confidence, but we, the women of Montparnasse, work quietly. Our hands are red from the cold water, but we do not complain. We have seen worse. We have survived the war. Now we must survive ourselves." This quiet endurance became the true mark of the heroines of 1920 seconds. Paris, not their fame, but their persistence. The art world was changing too. Galleries began to feature works by female artists, though often under the mentorship of male patrons. The École des Beaux-Arts had officially opened its doors to women in 1897, but by the 1920 seconds, enrollment was growing faster than ever. Still, female students often faced ridicule or exclusion from the more prestigious exhibitions. Many women turned instead to illustration, fashion design, or photography fields that were considered less serious but offered more opportunity. Fashion, in particular, became a means of quiet rebellion. The heavy corsets and elaborate dresses of the 19th century gave way to the practical simplicity of Coco Chanel's designs. Loose silhouettes, comfortable fabrics, and the androgynous look that shocked older generations. The heroines of Paris embraced this style not just for its beauty, but for its freedom. It allowed them to move, to work, to exist in public, without the burden of ornament. In the shops along the Boulevard Saint-Germain, mannequins displayed these new forms of liberation, but few women could afford them. Instead, they sewed their own versions, cutting old dresses into new shapes, turning coats inside out to extend their lives. The fashion revolution of Paris was not just a story of couture, it was also a story of thrift and ingenuity, born out of necessity. Outside the city centre, in neighbourhoods like Belleville and the 14th arrondissement, life was harder still. Many women lived in communal lodgings, sometimes sharing a single bed with shifts one slept while the other worked. The post-war economy had left many men unemployed or disabled, forcing women to take whatever jobs they could find. They worked in textile factories, laundries, or as domestic servants. The working day was long, and the pay was poor. Yet even in these forgotten corners of Paris, the influence of the heroine craze could be felt. Magazines and newspapers often published profiles of independent women, painters, writers, or socialites, portraying them as icons of freedom. Young girls read these stories by candlelight, imagining lives beyond the factory walls. The heroines became symbols of escape, even if their real lives were far more complex. Still, the contrast between image and reality was stark. Many of the so-called heroines faced their own struggles: addiction, loneliness, and financial ruin. Kiki de Montparnasse, for all her fame, often sold her paintings just to pay rent. Others, like Jeanne Hébuterne, the lover of Modigliani, faced tragic fates. The heroine craze celebrated independence, but society still judged women harshly when that independence turned to poverty. And yet, through the frost-covered windows of the cafes and the narrow alleys of Montparnasse, something new was being born. The heroines of the 1920 seconds were not defined by victory, but by persistence. They were the first generation of women to truly inhabit modernity, to shape their own identities in a world that was watching, judging, and slowly changing. By the end of that decade, their influence could be seen everywhere, in literature, art, fashion, and the growing idea that women could define their own lives. But the road to freedom was not glamorous. It was paved with grey mornings, cold fingers, and quiet acts of defiance. As another winter settled over Paris, the women of Montparnasse continued their routines. Writing, working, dreaming, surviving. Some would become legends, while others would vanish into the city's endless history. Yet together, they left behind something enduring, a new image of what it meant to live, to create, and to endure as a woman in the modern age. If you were to walk down Boulevard du Montparnasse on a January morning in 1924, you might notice how the smoke from chimneys hung low, mingling with the early fog. The cafes would still be half empty, their chairs stacked, the air faintly sour with the scent of spilled wine and damp wool. By mid-morning, the first wave of women would arrive, some artists, others simply seeking warmth. They carried sketchbooks, newspapers, or bundles of letters, the kinds of objects that served as both shield and invitation. To live as a woman in Paris during those winters was to move between spaces that were at once public and private, open and enclosed. There was freedom, yes, but it came wrapped in the constant awareness of being watched. Paris prided itself on its modernity, yet the city still held the invisible rules of old Europe. A woman could sit alone in a cafe now, but she was still expected to hold herself a certain way, to remain poised even when she was shivering. The daily geometry of survival. Everyday life in Paris had its own geometry. Rent was due at the start of each month. Wages came late, and coal was always short. The women who lived alone learned to ration their heat, boiling water only once a day, and keeping their windows closed tight. Many took on side work, copying manuscripts, translating English papers for American expatriates, or mending clothes for the wealthier families of the right bank. The few francs earned this way were carefully folded into notebooks, often next to scraps of poetry or unfinished sketches. Some women worked as models for painters. It was a precarious occupation, half artistic, half transactional, sitting still for hours in the cold studios of Montparnasse. They became subjects for paintings that might later hang in galleries, but rarely did they share in the profit. A session might earn 5 francs, 10 if the artist was generous. To supplement this, some models worked in cafes at night, serving absinthe to men who sometimes recognized them from the canvases. The strange duality of visibility and invisibility defined their lives. They were immortalized in art, but forgotten in the streets. And yet, there was something empowering in being seen. The women who modeled for artists were no longer confined to domestic invisibility. They had become part of the city's creative bloodstream. Kiki de Montparnasse, whose real name was Alice Prynne, understood this perfectly. To pose, she once said, was to be both object and author. The artist saw you, but you also shaped what he saw. Her confidence masked hardship. She had grown up poor, worked as a laundress, and had been thrown out of school for immorality. Yet she carved a place for herself in history, not by privilege, but by persistence. The rhythm of the studios. The studios themselves were worlds of quiet chaos. The most famous were the Cité Falguière and La Ruche, a beehive-like complex of ateliers, built from the remnants of the 1,900 World's Fair. Inside, stoves burned low, and every surface was covered in paints, canvases, and cigarette ash. The air was heavy with turpentine and pipe smoke. It was in these spaces that some of the most striking collaborations of the decade took shape between men and women, artists and muses, equals and exploiters. For the women who painted, the challenge was not only artistic, but social. The Paris art world had its hierarchies, and gender was one of the most rigid. Women were often steered toward feminine subjects, portraits, flowers, domestic interiors, while men were free to explore abstraction and the avant-garde. Still, many persisted in defying these expectations. Artists like Tamara de Lempicka and Marie Laurencin carved out their own niches, painting with sharp lines and muted sensuality that reflected both elegance and control. Tamara, with her sleek, almost metallic portraits, embodied the new woman, autonomous, glamorous, untouchable. She drove her own car, smoked long cigarettes, and spoke 5 languages. Yet behind her Art Deco perfection was a deep anxiety about belonging. Born in Poland, displaced by revolution, she lived between nations, between identities, a reflection of the age itself. Marie Laurencin, quieter but no less influential, painted pastel worlds where women existed without men, soft yet unyielding. In her canvases, one could glimpse a dream of companionship, without hierarchy, a utopia painted in powder blue. Outside these rarefied circles, the lesser-known artists fought daily for recognition. They carried their canvases through snow to galleries that often turned them away. Some joined collectives, forming small circles of mutual support. They exhibited in the Salon des Indépendants, or the Salon d'Automne. The public often dismissed their work as naive, but slowly, quietly, their presence changed the city's artistic map. The studios, for all their hardship, were also spaces of warmth. When the cold outside became unbearable, artists would gather, huddled around a single heater, sharing stories, cigarettes, and cheap wine. There were debates about surrealism, arguments about cubism, and laughter that echoed through the night. Some nights ended with piano music drifting through cracked windows. It was these small, fleeting moments, half bored, half beautiful, that defined the winters more than any single painting could. The cafes as sanctuaries. While the studios provided space to create, the cafes offered space to exist. La Rotonde, Le Dôme, La Coupole, names that would later become shorthand for Bohemian Paris, were, in truth, refuges from the cold. For the price of one coffee, a woman could sit for hours, warming her hands on the cup, watching the endless flow of people pass by. Here, boundaries blurred. Artists, models, waiters, and philosophers all shared the same space, though not always the same status. The American expatriates, the lost generation, often dominated conversations. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, and Gertrude Stein became fixtures, their English voices mixing with French and Italian and Russian. For local women, these visitors represented both opportunity and intrusion. The Americans brought money, attention, and a certain exotic glamour, but they also imported their own forms of idealism and exploitation. One could find women like Adrienne Monnier, the bookseller who ran La Maison des Amis des Livres, sitting quietly near the back of the cafe. She was not a painter or model, but a purveyor of ideas. Her bookshop became a meeting place for writers, including James Joyce and Sylvia Beach, who ran the English language Shakespeare and Company. Monnier represented a different kind of heroine, one who built communities rather than art. Her strength lay in her constancy. She was always there, in her grey cardigan, arranging books even as the cold crept in from under the door. The cafe tables, slick with condensation and ink, became stages for transformation. A woman could rewrite herself there, if only for a few hours. The hum of conversation offered both distraction and possibility. Friendships were formed, romances began, and ideas took shape in the half-light of cigarette smoke. Isolation in the crowd. Yet for all the liveliness, there was also an undercurrent of loneliness. Many of the women who came to Paris left behind families who disapproved of their independence. Letters home were often censored in tone short, polite, and vague about the reality of their lives. All is well, one might write, even while sitting in a room so cold that the ink froze mid-sentence. Isolation took different forms. For some, it was creative frustration, the inability to find their voice in a city that romanticized women but rarely listened to them. For others, it was the exhaustion of survival, the endless repetition of small tasks that left no time for dreams. The heroines of Montparnasse were surrounded by people, yet often profoundly alone. A diary entry from 1925 by an unknown seamstress captures this feeling with painful simplicity. The city is so full that one cannot breathe, and yet there is no one to talk to. I watch the people at the cafe and imagine that someone might look at me, but they never do. I am invisible, even to the cold. Invisibility became, paradoxically, a form of endurance. To disappear into the crowd was to escape scrutiny, to find privacy in public. Some women cherished this quiet anonymity, turning it into a source of inner strength. It allowed them to observe, to think, to dream without interference. The weight of change. By the middle of the decade, change was in the air. The modern woman had become both an ideal and a controversy. Newspapers debated whether women's new freedoms, short skirts, smoking, public work, signaled progress or moral decay. The term garçon, meaning boyish girl, entered popular use, inspired by Victor Marguerite's scandalous novel of 1922. The protagonist, a woman who cuts her hair and rejects marriage, became a symbol of everything both celebrated and feared about the new generation. In the salons and cafes of Paris, women discussed the novel in hushed tones. Some embraced it as liberation. Others resented how it reduced their struggles to fashion. But whether loved or loathed, the garçon had arrived, reshaping how femininity was seen. Still, the change was uneven. The freedom of Montparnasse rarely extended to the poorer districts. In factories and workshops, women continued to earn half the wages of men. Many faced harassment and dismissal if they spoke out. Feminist movements existed, but their voices were often drowned out by louder, more glamorous narratives. The heroine craze, for all its revolutionary air, often glossed over these realities. And yet, beneath the surface, the groundwork was being laid for something lasting. The quiet acts of defiance, the decision to live alone, to work, to create, to endure, were rewriting the social order, one winter at a time. The streets of Paris, slick with melted snow, reflected the faint glow of gas lamps. Inside the cafes, the heroines of the decade sat wrapped in scarves, surrounded by the hum of possibility and fatigue. They were both the dream and the reality of their time symbols of freedom, yet still bound by the cold facts of survival. By 1927, the world seemed to move faster. Jazz spilled out of radios. Cars filled the boulevards. Airplanes crossed the skies that once belonged to pigeons and poets. Paris, ever restless, had become the heartbeat of modernity. But beneath its rhythm, the laughter, the art, the bright cafes, there was a slower pulse. The lives of the women who had carried the city through its winters. The heroine craze had reached its height, but already it was beginning to dissolve into myth. The word heroine, once a declaration of rebellion, had become a marketing term. Perfumes, novels, and posters adopted it. The heroines of Montparnasse, those women who had endured the grey cold of Paris with paint-stained fingers and ink-flecked coats, now found themselves turned into symbols romanticized, simplified, commodified. But real life, as always, was quieter. This final part of their story of how the heroines of the 1920 seconds met the end of their decade was not marked by triumph or tragedy, but by the slow, almost invisible act of endurance. The passing of the craze. The art world was changing again. The exuberance of cubism and surrealism had begun to wane, replaced by something more ordered, more commercial. The Great War was fading into history, and so too was the sense of rupture that had once driven artists to reinvent everything. For women, this shift was both liberating and limiting. The freedom of the early 20s had been chaotic but exhilarating. By the late decade, the chaos had settled into a pattern. Society had grown used to seeing women in short hair and short skirts. The garçon no longer shocked anyone. The rebellion, having become fashion, had lost its sting. But while the elite circles of Montparnasse were beginning to fade, ordinary women were quietly making lasting progress. More of them were working by 1929. Nearly a quarter of the French industrial workforce was female. Women in offices, shops, and schools began to normalize the sight of independence. The heroines of the cafes had made it imaginable. Now, others made it real. Yet with that progress came disillusionment. The dream of total equality was still distant. The French suffrage movement, less militant than in Britain or the U.S., continued to be ignored. Women could study art, publish novels, even open bookshops, but they could not vote. It was a peculiar contradiction. A city that led the world in modern art remained centuries behind in politics. Still, progress often hides in the dull details of daily life. Each winter brought small victories, more women signing contracts, more names appearing on gallery programs, more independence that no longer needed to announce itself. The artists' winters. The women who had defined the decade were each facing new seasons of their own. Kiki de Montparnasse, once the radiant center of Bohemian Paris, was growing older. Fame had given her confidence, but not stability. By 1930, the glamour had dimmed. Her friends had moved on to America, to film, to marriage. The cafes that had once been alive with art and arguments now catered to tourists chasing the ghosts of a fading era. Kiki turned to painting her own works, quieter, darker pieces that few bought. The city, she wrote later, was always most beautiful when I had nothing. Tamara de Lempicka, by contrast, rode the wave of modernity into high society. Her angular portraits of wealthy patrons, women with hard jaws and eyes like mirrors, became the aesthetic of the age. But even she confessed, privately, to feeling detached. The faces I paint, she said, are not the people. They are masks. Marie Laurencin continued her soft, dreamlike work, painting women in muted harmony long after the frenzy of the 20s had ended. Her style, once dismissed as decorative, came to symbolize something deeper, the quiet insistence of feminine space in art. She lived alone, content, surrounded by her pastel figures. Their lives, each so different, reflected the broader fate of the heroine archetype. Some adapted, some disappeared, a few endured, but together they left a trail of influence that reached far beyond their time, beyond Montparnasse. As the decade drew to a close, Paris itself began to transform. The construction of new buildings and the spread of electricity changed the city's rhythms. The night grew brighter. The cafes stayed open later. The depression loomed in the distance, though few yet understood what was coming. For the women of Paris, the changes were both economic and emotional. Many of those who had come to the city, chasing art, now turned to more stable professions, secretaries, translators, or teachers. The bohemian freedom that had defined their youth gave way to responsibility. A new generation arrived from abroad, idolizing the legends of the 1920 seconds, unaware that those legends were still alive, still paying rent, still cold in the winter. For working-class women, the promise of modernity felt more like a rumor. The factories of Saint-Denis and Belleville still paid women less, still offered no maternity leave, still fired them when they married. Yet even there, the influence of the heroines was felt in subtle ways. Young women read magazines, featuring images of short-haired models and imagined lives outside the factory walls. Small acts of imitation became silent acts of rebellion. The cafes, meanwhile, changed tone. The smoke and noise of the early 20s gave way to nostalgia. Tourists asked waiters where Hemingway used to sit. The waiters shrugged. He had moved on to Spain or America, it didn't matter. The true heart of Montparnasse had never been the famous names, but the countless others who had filled the background. The seamstress reading poetry in a corner, the student sketching her reflection in a glass, the model warming her hands on a cup of coffee. A winter of reflection. By 1931, Paris had entered a new decade, and the heroines of the 1920 seconds were already fading into history. The city, always hungry for novelty, had turned to new icons, the cinema stars, the fashion models, the political activists. Yet the legacy of those winters persisted, not in grand monuments, but in quieter freedoms. A woman could now rent an apartment on her own, without scandal. She could walk through the city at night and be regarded sometimes as a person rather than a curiosity. She could study, paint, write, or simply choose not to marry. The boundaries of what was possible had shifted, not through revolution, but through repetition, through thousands of women living ordinary lives with extraordinary quietness. The heroines of the 1920 seconds had not conquered the world, but they had changed its texture. They made solitude permissible, ambition possible, and imperfection visible. They turned the cold streets of Montparnasse into classrooms of endurance. Even their failures were meaningful. For every artist who never sold a painting, every writer who never published, every model who vanished into anonymity, there was a collective proof that women could exist in the world as themselves, not as someone's daughter, muse, or wife. The long thaw. It is easy, in hindsight, to romanticize that decade, to imagine a golden age of freedom and art. But the real winters of 1920 seconds, Paris, were neither glamorous nor tragic. They were simply human. Each morning brought the same choices. To rise from bed despite the cold, to walk to the cafe, to keep creating even when no one cared. Those choices, repeated day after day, built the invisible foundation of change. The heroine, Craze, faded, but what it left behind was more enduring than any fashion. The idea that a woman's quiet persistence could shape history as much as a man's bold gesture. The heroines of Montparnasse did not seek to be remembered. They sought to live. And in that simple, unglamorous desire to live, to work, to endure through one more winter, they gave us the truest picture of what courage looks like when no one is watching. And so, as the snow melts along the Seine and the cafes fill again with new voices, you might imagine one of those women, perhaps a nameless one sitting by the window, her breath fogging the glass. She stares at the grey sky and wonders, just as we might today, if you were to step into a government office in London in the year 1843, the first thing you might notice would not be the people, but the sound a low, unbroken murmur of scratching pens. It filled the long corridors and echoed softly through the vaulted rooms, a kind of bureaucratic hum that never quite stopped. Beneath the pale winter light, hundreds of clerks bent over ledgers, their shoulders hunched, their cuffs smudged with ink. Outside, the city was in the full vigour of the Industrial Revolution. Steam engines roared along the Thames. Factories belched smoke into a permanently grey sky. Horse carts rattled over cobblestones, carrying coal, linen, paper. Yet inside these offices, whether in the East India Company's headquarters on Leadenhall Street, the Treasury on Whitehall, or the post office in Street, Martin's Legrand the rhythm was slower, steadier, and strangely detached from the noise outside. This was the empire of paper, a quiet, relentless world that kept the rest of the empire running, the great clerical machine. In the early decades of the 19th century, Britain's administrative apparatus was expanding faster than the city itself. Empire meant paperwork, an endless torrent of reports, lists, and ledgers that had to be copied, stamped, filed, and referenced. The clerks were the invisible engineers of that process. They did not build ships or railways. They built order. A clerk's desk was both his kingdom and his prison. It was usually made of dark wood, its surface worn smooth by decades of elbows and ledgers. The drawers smelled faintly of sealing wax and old ink. Piles of correspondence sat in uneven stacks. Memoranda, petitions, invoices, reports from India or Canada or the Caribbean. The handwriting varied from the elegant loops of aristocrats to the hurried scrawl of merchants. Each document needed to be entered, copied, and stored. The work was repetitive, yet deeply precise. A single error in a ledger could cost a department a fortune, or an official his position. Clerks learned to form their letters perfectly, to align numbers with near-mechanical precision. To the outsider, it all seemed dull. But to the men who lived within that rhythm, there was a quiet satisfaction in it, a belief that the empire itself depended on their accuracy. The civil service was still, in those years, a mixture of aristocracy and ambition. Many clerks were sons of middle-class families who could not afford military commissions or university degrees. Others were younger sons of minor gentry, sent to London with letters of recommendation. They arrived with little but good handwriting and the hope of a stable salary. Advancement was slow, dependent on seniority and spotless work. It was not unusual for a man to spend 40 years in the same department, rising only 1 or 2 ranks before retirement. A day in the office. A typical workday began before the fog lifted. By 8:30, the streets near Westminster were already full of clerks walking briskly, their coats buttoned against the drizzle, briefcases clutched tightly in gloved hands. They filed into offices where the fires had been lit just moments before. The smell of coal smoke mixed with that of damp wool and stale paper. The morning was devoted to correspondence. Letters from the colonies arrived in heavy sacks, reports on taxation, exports, court decisions, and occasional scandals. The senior clerks sorted them by subject, while the juniors began copying extracts into the ledgers. Each department had its own system of record-keeping, its own numbering and indexing conventions, guarded jealously like trade secrets. At 11, tea was served, not the leisurely tea of the upper classes, but a brief pause. A few sips, a few murmured jokes about superiors, and then back to the ledgers. The afternoons were slower, the air thick with heat from the fires and the faint metallic scent of ink. By 4 o'clock, eyes began to blur and the pages seemed to swim. Yet the clerks continued, methodically turning sheets, blotting margins, folding documents into packets, tied with red tape, literally red tape, thin strips of dyed cloth that would one day become the symbol of bureaucracy itself. By 6, the lamps were lit, and the offices began to empty. Outside, London had already turned dark. Some clerks went home to small lodgings in Bloomsbury or Islington. Others stopped at public houses along Fleet Street, where conversations often turned to promotions, departmental rumours, or the latest parliamentary debates. Few spoke of the work itself. The work, like breathing, was simply there. The romance of the ordinary. To modern eyes, it may seem absurd that such monotony could define an era, but for 19th century clerks, the dullness was a kind of virtue. Stability was prized above excitement. Adventure belonged to soldiers and explorers. Respectability belonged to those who stayed put. The empire needed men who could endure tedium without error. The novelist Charles Lamb, himself a clerk at the East India Company for more than 30 years, once wrote that the office was a prison, yet a kindly one. He found poetry in the routine, the rows of desks, the piles of paper, the camaraderie born of shared endurance. It was, in its way, a miniature society. Hierarchies were strict, but relationships were steady. There was comfort in predictability. Outside the office, London was a city of contrasts. The same men who spent their days maintaining the empire's paperwork would walk home through streets filled with beggars, street vendors, and costermongers shouting over barrels of fruit. Clerks occupied a curious middle ground, educated enough to understand their power, but never rich enough to enjoy it fully. They watched the world change through ink-stained fingers. For many, the greatest aspiration was a pension and a modest cottage in the countryside. The career ladder was a slow ascent, measured not in ambition, but endurance. Promotions came with age, not brilliance. A steady hand and an unremarkable life were the keys to success. The material world of paper. If the clerks were the heart of bureaucracy, paper was its lifeblood. The 19th century was the golden age of British papermaking, and London was one of its biggest consumers. Government departments devoured reams of foolscap and vellum every week. The quality of paper mattered. It had to last decades, even centuries, in archives. The transition from handmade rag paper to machine-produced sheets was gradual, and many clerks distrusted the new, cheaper stock. Ink, too, was a subject of endless discussion. Iron gall ink, made from oak galls and ferrous sulfate, was the standard permanent, but prone to corrode paper over time. Clerks were trained to use it sparingly, to keep their nibs clean, and to never leave ink bottles uncorked overnight. The smallest mistake, a blot, a smudge, could ruin a document. Filing systems grew increasingly complex. Each letter was logged, copied, and stored according to its subject and origin. Entire rooms were filled with cabinets, their drawers labelled in precise script. Revenue: East India, 1,841, 1,843. Dust settled on everything. The scent of old paper mixed with the sharp tang of ink and wax, forming an atmosphere that seemed, to those who worked in it, both oppressive and oddly reassuring. The phrase "to be filed" carried a finality of its own. Once a document was filed, it was as though it had entered a second life, no longer active, but preserved. In these archives, the empire's memory accumulated. Long after the clerks themselves were gone, their handwriting would remain, lined up in neat columns, a testament to their quiet labour. The faces behind the ink. Though the bureaucracy was mostly male, women began to appear at the edges by the mid-century first, as copyists and later as clerks in telegraph offices and post departments. Their pay was lower, their duties more restricted, yet their presence marked a subtle change. The same social logic that had once confined women to the home now found them indispensable in the expanding machinery of empire. Male clerks reacted with mixed feelings. Some welcomed the new efficiency women brought, others resented the competition. But the truth was that bureaucracy itself was indifferent. It absorbed anyone who could write neatly, file correctly, and endure monotony. Among the male clerks, personalities varied. There were dreamers who wrote poetry on the backs of ledgers, moralists who lectured their peers on punctuality, and cynics who mocked the whole system while still obeying it. Some saw their jobs as stepping stones to the profession's law, journalism, politics. Others knew they would never leave. They developed habits of patience that bordered on the monastic. It was not unusual for a man to work beside the same colleagues for decades, to grow old in the same office, his handwriting becoming shakier as the ledgers filled up. When he died, his name would be recorded in a small departmental register, a note written in the same ink he had used every day. No statues, no obituaries, just a line, filed under deceased staff, 1,872, the invisible architects. Yet, without them, the empire would have collapsed. Every ship that sailed to India, every law passed in Parliament, every coin minted or tax collected depended on the slow, methodical work of clerks. They were the translators between chaos and order, the keepers of numbers, the masters of routine. It was said that Britain's real strength was not its navy, but its paperwork, that the empire ran on ledgers as much as on steam. The bureaucratic mind valued documentation over drama, process over impulse. To the clerk, History itself was just another file waiting to be indexed. And so, day after day, they sat beneath the gas lamps, copying, cataloguing, and calculating, building, without knowing it, the foundations of modern administration. Their handwriting shaped the world. Their boredom held it together. The fog thickens outside. The lamps in the corridors flicker. Somewhere, a clerk yawns and dips his pen again. He does not know that his quiet labor will outlast empires that future. Generations will study his ledgers to understand how the modern state was built. He only knows that the ink must dry before he can close the book. And perhaps, as he wipes his pen and looks out the window at the grey London dusk, he wonders, the year is 1856. The British Empire stands at its widest reach. Yet India, Australia, the Caribbean, Canada, and a growing web of colonies across Africa. Every decision made in those distant lands, every shipment of tea, every court ruling, every mile of railway produces paper, reports, receipts, manifests, contracts, and all of it ends up, eventually, in London, behind the marble facades of Whitehall and the grey-stoned buildings of the city. The machinery of order has grown vast. Departments now stretch across multiple buildings. Entire rooms exist just for sorting mail. The army of clerks has multiplied. Some estimate there are more than 50,000 men, and now, increasingly, women working in the public offices of Britain. They are the civil sinews of empire, and their world runs on routine. Yet this is not a democracy of paper. It is a hierarchy, as rigid as any military chain of command. The architecture of bureaucracy. To walk into a 19th century office was to enter a pyramid built of ink and discipline. At the bottom stood the junior clerks, young men barely out of school, earning £70 a year, expected to copy, calculate, and keep silent. Above them were the second clerks, men with a few years of experience who could draft basic correspondence or check figures. Then came the senior clerks, who supervised entire sections, managing correspondence between departments or colonies. At the top of the ladder were the chief clerks, some of whom wielded more power than the ministers they served. Every promotion was a ritual of endurance. Years of flawless work were the only currency that counted. Ambition was not displayed but contained. To appear too eager was to seem untrustworthy. To appear indifferent was to be respectable. Each department had its own habits and temperament. The Treasury was formal, its language dry and precise. The Home Office was dense with legal correspondence. The Colonial Office, always swamped, was famous for its chaos boxes of reports from distant governors stacked against walls. The air thick with dust from dispatches shipped across the world. A visitor might have found the sight impressive but impenetrable. Row after row of men, all writing. Yet every letter had a purpose, every column a rule. Bureaucracy was a living organism, and its clerks were its cells. The rituals of routine. Each morning began with the unlocking of the letter boxes. Porters carried in heavy sacks tied with twine, their contents still damp from sea air. The smell of the world, salt, spice, mildew, entered the London offices with them. Clerks sorted the correspondence into categories: urgent, routine, to be acknowledged, for the archives. The process of acknowledgement was itself a ritual. Each letter received a docket number and a note of receipt. Replies were drafted according to prescribed phrases. Sir, I am directed by the Secretary of State to acknowledge the receipt of your letter dated the 14th instant. The phrase the 14th instant, meaning of this month, was one of hundreds of formulae that gave bureaucratic English its bide. Peculiar rhythm. Polite, precise, utterly drained of emotion. Once written, letters were copied by hand into ledgers before being sent. There was no carbon paper yet. Duplication meant rewriting. A senior clerk checked every outgoing letter for tone and accuracy. A misplaced word could imply an insult to a colonial governor or a financial misstatement. It was not unusual for a single paragraph to be rewritten half a dozen times. The monotony was staggering, but it was monotony with purpose. The empire could only function if its paperwork was correct. One missing figure in a customs report might mean months of confusion at a port. A misfiled letter might delay payment to a regiment abroad. To prevent chaos, the clerks cultivated habits of extreme caution. They did not trust memory. They trusted lists, the science of filing. If the 19th century had a religion of order, the clerks were its priests, and filing was their liturgy. Filing was not merely about storage, it was about retrieval, a system of knowledge. A good filing system allowed a clerk to locate a letter written 15 years ago within minutes. Departments prided themselves on the elegance of their methods. Some used chronological logs, others geographical indexes. The colonial office's blue books, annual summaries of reports from every territory, became famous for their precision. Paper was power. Whoever controlled the archives controlled the narrative. When disputes arose over trade figures, troop numbers, or the legality of a tax, it was the files that settled them. A senior clerk could, with a quiet flourish, retrieve a document proving that a minister's memory was wrong. And so the office became a place, not just of labour, but of hidden authority. The clerks, though publicly invisible, knew where everything was buried, sometimes literally. The empire's collective memory lived in their drawers, the human cost of paper. Yet such perfection came at a price. The work consumed lives. The posture of writing shoulders forward, eyes down, produced chronic pain. Clerks spoke of writer's cramp and the ink hand, a form of muscle fatigue that could end a career. The constant exposure to gaslight strained their eyesight. Some went half-blind by middle age. Doctors of the time even coined a term, clerical melancholy. It described the dull depression that came from endless repetition. A man could spend decades copying figures without ever seeing the results of his labour. He might record the movement of goods to Calcutta, but never see Calcutta. Calculate the cost of famine relief, but never see a hungry face. His world was numbers and names, never people. For many, the solace came from small rituals, the morning tea, the sound of a quill scratching, the companionship of others who understood the strange pride of precision. They joked about their superiors, about misplaced files, about the absurdity of bureaucracy itself. Some formed reading clubs, debating politics or poetry in the evenings. The office became a microcosm of the Victorian ideal, respectable, industrious, and quietly enduring. Still, the isolation grew. Letters came and went, but the clerks remained. Their handwriting might reach every corner of the empire, but they themselves rarely left the city. London was their world, a world of fog, gaslight, and ledgers, the rise of the machine. In the 1,860 seconds, something new entered this world of pens and ink, the typewriter. At first, it was a curiosity. Early models were clumsy, unreliable, and loud. Clerks distrusted them. The idea that a machine could replace handwriting felt almost sacrilegious. But progress was relentless. By the 1,880 seconds, typewriters had improved enough to appear in some government offices. They were faster, more uniform, and crucially, easier to read. The sound of tapping keys began to mingle with the scratching of pens. A generational divide opened. Older clerks frowned at the noise, younger ones embraced it as modernity. With the typewriter came new workers. Typing was seen as delicate, suitable for female hands. By the end of the century, offices once filled entirely with men were now dotted with young women at typewriters, their hair pinned neatly, their movements efficient and silent. The pace of work increased. Files grew thicker, The empire's paper arteries expanded further. The clerks adapted, reluctantly, but something of the old rhythm was lost. The slow, meditative pace of penmanship, replaced by the mechanical tempo of keys. Some older men retired early, unable to keep up. Others, nostalgic for the ink and blotter, would wander into the archives during lunch breaks, just to touch the old ledgers. Between empire and individual, there is a strange irony in the life of a bureaucrat. He is both essential and invisible. The clerks knew this. They watched ministers come and go, each claiming reform, each promising efficiency. But the real work never changed. It continued quietly in the same rooms, under the same lamps, with the same tools. When the Indian Rebellion of 1857 erupted, the clerks of the East India House worked overtime, processing telegrams and reports from the front. The crisis passed through their desks as ink on paper. For them, war was not a battle, but a stack of dispatches labelled urgent. The empire's drama, its rebellions, its conquests, its moral dilemmas, arrived as words. The clerks rarely discussed the ethics of it all. Their job was not to judge, but to record. Yet some must have wondered, as they transcribed the figures of casualties or the profits of the trade, where their duty ended and conscience began. Perhaps this was the quietest tension of all the moral stillness of bureaucracy, to serve the machine of empire without seeing its cost. The quiet revolution. By the 1870s, the civil service had begun to change from within. A new principle was emerging: meritocracy. The old system of patronage, where jobs were handed out through family connections, was slowly being replaced by competitive examinations. It was a revolution in slow motion, but it reshaped the bureaucracy from the inside out. Young men from modest backgrounds could now earn their place through knowledge and discipline. The exams tested history, arithmetic, and moral philosophy. To prepare, aspiring clerks attended grammar schools, studying late into the night by candlelight. Success meant not glory, but stability, a steady wage, a desk, and the quiet prestige of government work. The exam system encouraged a new type of worker, the analytical, rule-bound mind. The bureaucratic temperament was becoming scientific. Reports were standardized. Procedures were codified. Departments communicated through printed forms rather than letters. Paper was no longer just a medium, it was a structure. The clerks of this generation were the ancestors of the modern civil servant. They believed in efficiency, neutrality, and precision. They were building something they could barely name, a state that ran by rules rather than by will. And so the 19th century moved forward, page by page, ledger by ledger. Outside, London's skyline changed. Railways cut through neighbourhoods, telegraph wires webbed the sky, and the empire reached further still. Inside, the clerks kept writing. The hum of pens and keys filled the air. The world was speeding up. But bureaucracy remained constant, a slow heart beating beneath the frenzy of progress. By the final decades of the 19th century, the hum of bureaucratic life in London had become part of the city's part life, background music. The sound of pens scratching against parchment, the soft click of inkwells, and the steady shuffle of papers were as constant as the tolling of church bells or the clatter of horse hooves outside. The British Empire had become not only the largest territorial dominion in history, it had become the most documented. Some said the empire existed as much in its paperwork as in its geography. Every treaty, census, tax roll, and court record, every administrative action was preserved in boxes, bound, labelled, and stored. Bureaucracy had achieved what no ruler, general, or merchant could: the illusion of permanence. But behind the illusion lay human fatigue. By 1890, the clerks who had once taken pride in their neat handwriting were beginning to feel buried beneath the very system they had built. The archives of empire. Imagine an afternoon in the record office at Chancery Lane, around 1893. The room is lined from floor to ceiling with shelving, each slot filled with leather-bound ledgers. Dust motes drift lazily in the shafts of light that fall through the high windows. The air is cool, faintly damp, heavy with the smell of old vellum and mould. A single clerk, his back slightly bent, moves slowly along the aisles with a ladder, retrieving a volume from 1824. The book is heavy, its pages thick, its edges darkened by age. He carries it to a long oak table and opens it carefully, revealing columns of ink still crisp after 70 years. This is how the Empire remembers. Each line represents an entry in the vast ledger of control. Goods shipped, taxes levied, punishments enacted, lives recorded. For every war fought abroad, there are 10,000 pages of accounts written here. The paper empire stretches backward in time, as surely as it stretches outward across continents. The clerks understand this better than anyone. They are not only workers, they are custodians of history. They know that governments rise and fall, but records endure. Empire may someday vanish, but the handwriting will remain. The bureaucratic mind. By this time, the culture of bureaucracy had begun to define not only the empire, but the modern mind itself. The clerk's habits, methodical, rational, procedural, were seeping into every institution. Schools, hospitals, banks, and railways. Order had become a moral principle. Accuracy was a virtue. Efficiency was progress. This mindset, born in dusty offices, began to shape how people thought about society. If paperwork could organize the empire, perhaps paperwork could also organize humanity, its laws, its welfare, even its morality. Statistics emerged as the new language of truth. Governments began counting things they had never counted before. Births, deaths, crimes, diseases, and occupations. To count was to know, and to know was to control. The clerks became the high priests of this new faith. Their ledgers were sacred texts, their calculations acts of civic devotion. Yet beneath the neat columns and clear ink, something unsettling stirred a question about whether the machinery they built could ever be humane. The people behind the process. One of the quiet tragedies of the clerical life was anonymity. Most clerks left no trace of themselves except their handwriting. Their names rarely appeared on the documents they created. Their signatures were often replaced by initials or departmental stamps. And yet, within the monotony, individuality persisted. In the margins of ledgers, one might still find faint traces of personality, a flourish in the letter G, a doodle in the corner, a note of irritation, figures unclear, see previous entry. A few clerks escaped obscurity. Charles Lamb, long retired from the East India Company, became famous for his essays, where he described the bittersweet dignity of office life. Another, Anthony Trollope, turned his postal career into a wellspring of novels about English respectability and quiet ambition. But most remained, unknown, their labour absorbed into the vast system they served. Still, they found meaning in small things. A balanced ledger, a well-written memorandum, the satisfaction of order in a disordered world. They lived within boundaries, and within those boundaries, they found peace. Women at the desk. By the 1892, the office was no longer a purely masculine world. The expansion of the telegraph, postal, and railway systems had created an insatiable demand for clerical labour. Women, long confined to domestic service or teaching, entered these new professions in growing numbers. They were paid less, of course, but their precision and patience made them invaluable. The female typist became an emblem of modern efficiency, her hands moving swiftly over the keys, her demeanour composed, her mistakes rare. The presence of women subtly changed the atmosphere of the office. There were stricter codes of conduct now, an emphasis on propriety and decorum. The language of bureaucracy softened, slightly. adopting a veneer of civility that mirrored the social changes of the time. Still, the work remained exhausting. Women were often dismissed upon marriage, their careers erased as quietly as they had begun. Their contribution to the machinery of empire was immense, but largely unacknowledged. They, too, became part of the paper empire names on payroll lists, signatures on memoranda, forgotten by the next generation. Paper, power, and paradox. As the century turned, the empire's bureaucracy had reached a kind of perfection. Communication between London and the colonies was faster than ever, thanks to the telegraph. Decisions that once took months could now be made in days. But speed brought new burdens. The more efficient the system became, the more paper it generated. Every telegram produced a follow-up letter. Every letter a report. Every report a file. Every file a debate. Bureaucracy fed on its own success. In 1901, the year of Queen Victoria's death, the British government spent more on stationery than on education. It was said, half-jokingly, that the empire could not function for a single day without ink. Behind that humour lay a truth. Paper had become the foundation of authority. What was not written did not exist. A decision, unrecorded, was a decision unmade. The clerks, though nameless, were now the custodians of reality itself. The slow unravelling. With the 20th century came machines filing cabinets, typewriters, adding machines, and carbon paper that promised to simplify the work. But they only multiplied it. For every innovation, there was a new form to fill, a new procedure to master. Old clerks muttered that the soul had gone out of the office. The gentle patience of handwriting had been replaced by the staccato urgency of typewriting. Reports were shorter, blunter, more mechanical. The human touch was vanishing, and yet the bureaucracy endured. Wars came and went. Governments changed. Empires rose and fell. But the clerks remained, their purpose unaltered, to record, to verify, to preserve. Even as Britain's global power waned, its paper empire grew denser. The files of the 19th century became the archives of the 20th. Somewhere in those endless stacks, the story of the clerks themselves was buried, a history without heroes, written in neat columns of ink, the legacy of order today. When you walk through the National Archives at Kew, you are walking through the afterlife of their labour. Every shelf, every box, every line of faded ink is the ghost of a clerk's day. The handwriting is uniform, yet each stroke once belonged to a living hand, a man or woman who woke early, walked through the fog, and sat down at a desk to make sense of the world. Their work built the backbone of modern administration. The spreadsheets, databases, and electronic records of our time are their descendants. We still live within the systems they created, the logic of procedure, the faith in documentation, the belief that to manage is to understand. But the clerks also left us a warning, a quiet one, written between the lines. They showed how easily order can become its own end, how the pursuit of perfect records can obscure the human lives those records describe. In the flicker of a gas lamp on Whitehall, in the echo of a pen scratching across paper, lies a simple truth. Civilization is not built by heroes or conquerors, but by those who endure monotony with care. The final entry. It is late in the evening now. The office is emptying. A lone clerk remains, his coat draped over the back of his chair. He closes the last ledger of the day and sets his pen aside. The ink dries slowly under the lamplight. Outside, London's fog thickens, swallowing the gas lamps one by one. He pauses before extinguishing the light. His eyes linger on the neat stack of papers. Letters copied, numbers verified, reports filed. It is the sum of his day's labour, and it will vanish into a cabinet by morning. He wonders, perhaps for the first time, whether anyone will ever read it. Then he smiles faintly, adjusts his spectacles, and turns out the lamp. The empire of paper sleeps silent, ordered, infinite. And somewhere, deep in its archives, the ink is still drying. If you stand on the deck of a merchant ship in the late 18th century, say, around 1795, you will hear almost nothing but wind and water. The sails groan softly, the rigging creaks, and somewhere below deck, a rope knocks lazily against the mast. The ocean stretches out on every side, featureless and immense. Days pass without change. The same horizon, the same light, the same men, the same work. This is the quiet sea, the other half of the Age of Empire. For every naval battle or heroic voyage written into history, there were 1,000 uneventful crossings. Ships that carried not soldiers or explorers, but barrels of salt pork, bolts of linen, crates of sugar, sacks of coffee, or casks of rum. They were the arteries of a growing global economy. And they moved, not by drama, but by endurance. The merchant sailor was, above all else, a man who could wait, the ship as a small world. The typical merchant vessel of this period was between 100 and 400 tons, wooden, square-rigged, and manned by a crew of 15 to 30 men. She was built for cargo, not comfort. Her decks were narrow, her cabins low-ceilinged, her smell a mix of tar, salt, and stale provisions. Every ship was a miniature society. The captain ruled absolutely, his word law at sea. Beneath him were the mates, who managed navigation and discipline, the boatswain, who oversaw the rigging and sails, the carpenter and cook, specialists essential to survival, and the ordinary seaman, who did everything else. The hierarchy was unbending, but it was not cruel so long as the ship ran smoothly. A good captain knew that morale mattered more than punishment. A bad one could make even a calm voyage feel like a prison sentence. Most voyages lasted months, sometimes more than a year. A run from London to Calcutta could take 6 months with favourable winds, and longer if storms or doldrums intervened. Time was measured not in days, but in watches, the 4-hour shifts that divided the endless rotation of work and rest. Morning, afternoon, dog watch, midnight, work, eat, sleep, repeat. The sea flattened everything into rhythm. The routine of the ordinary seaman life, for an ordinary sailor, was relentless, but rarely dramatic. The stories of storms and shipwrecks that fill maritime legend were exceptions. Most days were filled with chores, hauling lines, scrubbing decks, polishing brass, repairing sails. The day began before dawn. At the change of watch, the off-duty crew would stumble below deck, ducking their heads under beams blackened with soot and smoke. The air was heavy and close. Hammocks swung in rows, each barely an arm's width apart. The men slept fully clothed, their clothes stiff with salt. Meals were plain and repetitive. Salt beef or pork, hardtack biscuits, and pea soup formed the core diet. The biscuits were so hard they had to be soaked before eating. The salt meat often smelled of brine and rot. Fresh water was rationed, and by the second month at sea, even that began to taste of wood and algae. Sickness was constant. Scurvy, caused by lack of vitamin C, was the sailor's quietest enemy. The gums would swell and bleed, the skin bruised at a touch, old wounds reopened. In the 1790s, lime juice was beginning to be issued on British ships, but merchant captains often considered it an unnecessary expense. On those voyages, the disease still stalked the decks, yet men adapted. They joked, sang, told stories, and carved trinkets from spare wood. They lived by habit, and habit was their defense against madness. The art of waiting. Sailing in this age meant submission to wind, to weather, to time. There were days when the sea lay flat and glassy, the sails hanging limp in the heat. Ship would drift, barely moving, the sun burning the deck boards until the tar softened underfoot. These were the doldrums, where time seemed to stop. The crew passed the hours repairing gear or sitting silently by the rail, staring at nothing. The boredom could be oppressive. Some turned to gambling or drinking, others to fights. The captain's job, during these long pauses, was as much psychological as nautical. He had to keep his crew occupied, to give structure to the formlessness of waiting. Then, without warning, the wind would rise again. Sails would snap to life, ropes tighten, orders shouted down the line. The sudden violence of motion, the tilt of the deck, the rush of spray, felt almost joyful after so much stillness. The sea demanded obedience. A single mistake, a loose knot, a delayed command could mean catastrophe. Every man knew his role. Even in calm weather, drills were constant. Reef the topsails, man the braces. The shouts echoed up the masts, followed by the creak of wood and the rhythmic slap of rope. For all its monotony, the work had its own beauty, a choreography of practiced motion, a kind of maritime ballet, performed by men who knew every inch of their floating world. Navigation and the science of precision. Beneath the routine lay a quiet marvel of human ingenuity, the art of navigation. By 1780, the science of finding one's way at sea had reached a new level of precision, but it was still an art wrapped in uncertainty. The navigator, or first mate, relied on three instruments above all: the sextant, the chronometer, and the log line. Each morning, when the sun rose, he took its angle above the horizon and compared it against the time on his chronometer. With that, he could calculate the ship's position, its latitude and longitude. Within a few miles, the chronometer was the key. It was a clock so finely made that it could keep time accurately, even through the ship's motion. 1 second of error meant a quarter mile of misjudgment. The chronometer had revolutionized navigation, but it also introduced a new anxiety: mechanical dependence. Every few days, the officer on watch would check the chronometer against a reference chart, recording tiny differences in seconds, aware that the entire voyage rested on that delicate mechanism. The calculations filled pages of the ship's log: numbers, angles, bearings, times. It was the bureaucratic side of the sea, a record-keeping discipline, as precise as any London office. The ocean might be vast and formless, but the logbook imposed order. Every noon, the captain signed his name in the margin, his signature as steady as if he were back on land. Cargo and commerce. To the men on board, cargo was weight and space. To the merchants in London or Bombay, it was profit. A single voyage might carry thousands of pounds worth of goods: spices from Ceylon, indigo from Bengal, tea from Canton, or cotton from America. Each barrel was counted, marked, and recorded in a bill of lading before departure. These records followed the ship like shadows. If a single crate went missing, an investigation would follow, and a man's wages might be docked for negligence. In this way, the global economy depended on invisible chains of trust. A ship's captain was both mariner and accountant. His logbooks were financial documents as much as navigational ones. In the counting houses of London, clerks pored over these ledgers, matching figures against receipts. Every voyage became part of the empire's paperwork. The sailors understood little of the trade itself. They knew only the physicality of it, the smell of sugar fermenting in the hold, the dust of coffee beans, the weight of casks rolled into place. For them, the cargo was simply ballast, something to be guarded against storm and theft. But it connected them, unknowingly, to the vast web of empire, to plantations in the Caribbean, warehouses in Liverpool, markets in Calcutta. Every wave that slapped against the hull was part of that invisible commerce. Moments of stillness. Even at sea, there were quiet moments that seemed to belong to another world entirely. At night, when the watch was small and the sails filled gently, the ocean could feel infinite and serene. The stars reflected off the water like a second sky. The helmsman stood at his wheel, eyes fixed on the compass, while the rest of the crew leaned against the rails, smoking or humming quietly. The ship moved with a slow grace, her canvas gleaming silver in the moonlight. The air was cool, almost sweet, and the only sound was the steady sigh of water against wood. It was in these hours that sailors felt closest to something vast and unknowable. Religion and superstition blended freely at sea. Many men carried small talismans, bits of rope, coins, or charms carved from bone. Before dangerous passages, they might pour a libation overboard or whisper a prayer to St. Nicholas, the patron of sailors. No one spoke of faith much during the day, but at night, under the stars, it seemed impossible not to feel it. The sea was both a test and a teacher, indifferent, immense, and in its own way. Arrival and impermanence. Months later, when the first sight of land appeared, a faint line on the horizon, the smudge of a distant coast, the mood aboard shifted. Men who had spoken little began to talk again. Faces, long weathered by sun and salt, brightened. The smell of the wind changed. It carried earth in it. Arrival meant unloading, inspection, and weeks of labor in port. It also meant pay. Wages were calculated by the voyage, not the month. A man might not touch coin for half a year, then receive his entire earnings in one sum, minus the cost of provisions and repairs. Many sailors lost their pay within days, spent in taverns and brothels, before signing on for the next voyage. The ship itself, however, remained unchanged. She would be cleaned, re-rigged, and loaded again. The same names might appear on the muster roll. Others would vanish, replaced by new recruits. The voyage began again, as if nothing had happened. For the sea, memory did not exist. Each crossing was both a repetition and a renewal, a movement through space and time that erased its own traces. The merchant sailor of the late 18th century did not dream of glory. He dreamed of shore leave, of dry clothes, of the smell of fresh bread. He lived suspended between worlds, between continents, between classes, between the living and the drowned. He was, in every sense, a man of the in-between. And as the ship leaves port once more, the horizon swallows the land, and only the rhythm of wind and wave remains. The voyage begins again, without beginning or end. Yet somewhere in the silence between the creak of the ropes and the roll of the hull, a question lingers. When you have been at sea for 3 months, the days begin to merge. The wind changes, the sails shift, and the compass needle trembles. But everything else repeats itself. The same watch rotations, the same call for all hands on deck, the same meals, the same stars. It is as though time itself has become circular, not a line stretching toward destination, but a wheel endlessly turning. The men on a merchant ship learned to live inside that wheel. They measured their existence by small variations. The temperature of the wind, the texture of the biscuit, the angle of the sun. At noon, life became not about progress, but endurance. And yet within this monotony, the structure of maritime life was rich in quiet complexity. Every object, every habit, every sound had a meaning. The routine itself was the ship's heartbeat, mechanical, precise, and strangely human. The sound of labor. You would hear the ship before you saw her, a kind of wooden breathing, timbers groaning, ropes squealing through pulleys, the rhythmic splash of the bow cutting through waves. Each sound was distinct, yet all blended into a single continuous tone, the background noise of a seaborne world. At dawn, bells marked the change of watch. 6 bells meant the end of one man's shift and the beginning of another's. The men shuffled from their hammocks, pulling on stiff boots and jackets slick with dried salt. Above deck, the sky might be grey or gold. The weather changed, but the work did not. Every task had its own rhythm. The hauling of ropes came with shouted cadence calls. Heave! And she goes, to keep men pulling in unison. The scraping of the deck with holystones, blocks of soft sandstone used to clean the wood, produced a long, whispering sound that went on for hours. The boatswain's whistle cut through the air like a bird call, signalling orders too distant to shout. To an outsider, it might all have seemed chaotic. To the crew, it was a language, the hidden discipline of the sea. On land, men obeyed laws written by others. At sea, the rules came from necessity. A ship could not afford disorder. The chain of command was absolute, not by cruelty, but by survival. The captain carried full authority. He could dock pay, order confinement, or in rare cases, administer flogging. But most captains preferred order through respect. A disciplined crew worked more efficiently than a terrified one. The logbook was the heart of that order. Every 4 hours, the watch officer entered details of the ship's course, wind speed, and weather. Every deviation was recorded, every minor incident noted. Even the condition of the sails had its own column. The result was a daily chronicle, a document so precise that historians today can trace entire voyages, minute by minute. Discipline extended to the smallest acts. The anchor cable was always coiled clockwise. The hammocks were slung in the same order each night. The galley fire, fed with coal or charcoal, had to be extinguished and cleaned at precisely the same time each day. This precision created a paradox. The stricter the routine, the freer the men felt within it. The ship became a world they could control, even as the ocean defied them. Life below deck. Below deck, the ship was a different world, entirely dark, damp, and crowded. The smell was overwhelming. Tar, sweat, wet rope, salt meat, and the faint sweetness of spilled rum. Lanterns swung from the beams, their light dim and flickering. The crew slept in hammocks, each man allotted just enough space to turn over. When the weather grew hot, the air became suffocating. Rats scurried in the shadows, feeding on crumbs and grain. Cockroaches hid in the cracks of barrels. No one bothered to chase them anymore. They were simply part of life. Storage was everywhere. The ship's hold, divided by wooden partitions, contained the cargo: coffee beans, rice, indigo, tobacco, sugar, depending on the route. The crew's personal space was limited to a small sea chest or canvas bag. Inside might be a few shirts, a Bible or prayer book, a pipe, and perhaps a keepsake from home. Privacy did not exist. Conversations blended together, and the ship's low ceiling amplified every cough, every snore. Yet men learned to find solitude in noise. They stared into the lamplight or out through the narrow gun ports, watching the line of sea and sky move endlessly by. The cook and the ritual of eating. If there was one figure who held quiet power aboard ship, it was the cook. His galley was barely the size of a closet, but it was the center of daily life. Meals broke the monotony not by taste, but by timing. Breakfast might be oatmeal or ship's biscuit dipped in tea. Dinner, served at midday, was the main meal. Salted meat, boiled with peas or rice. Supper was lighter, sometimes a stew, sometimes leftovers. Fresh food was a luxury. When the ship reached tropical waters, barrels of meat, often spoiled. The crew could smell the rot before the cask was even opened. Sometimes, if no alternative existed, it was boiled anyway, the odour masked with vinegar or rum. Water was rationed to about 1 gallon a day per man, used for drinking and cooking. To make it last, beer or watered wine was often served instead. The officers ate slightly better preserved fruits, cheese, maybe a piece of bacon, but not much. Mealtimes brought a kind of fragile peace. Men sat together, legs braced against the rocking floor, eating in silence or low conversation. For a few minutes, work stopped. Then the bell rang again, and life resumed. Superstition and the fragile mind. The ocean bred superstition like humidity bred mold. With so much left to chance, the wind, the weather, diseased sailors sought patterns in the inexplicable. A whistling crewman was said to whistle up the wind. A cat carried aboard was good luck, but only if treated well. Bananas were thought to bring bad fortune. And women on board, unless they were disguised as men, were said to anger the sea. Before crossing the equator for the first time, new sailors underwent the line ceremony. It was half ritual, half hazing. Appeared, usually the boatswain in disguise, and initiated the untested crew. Buckets of water, mock trials, and laughter filled the deck. It was cruel, but it relieved tension, a moment of shared absurdity in an otherwise rigid life. Superstitions also provided psychological comfort. When storms struck and the ship heeled dangerously, prayers and charms gave men the illusion of control. Faith, whether in God or the sea itself, was not a luxury. It was a survival strategy. Storm season. No voyage was free from danger. The monotony could vanish overnight, replaced by chaos. When a storm approached, the air grew heavy, and the sea darkened into shades of steel and green. The captain's orders came quickly. Reef the topsails, secure the hatches, lash down the cargo. Every man moved with silent urgency. The wind arrived first, a roar that seemed to come from all directions. Rain followed, blinding and cold. The ship tilted, masts shuddering, sails thrashing like living things. Below deck, the world turned into a groaning cave. Water seeped through every seam. Barrels broke loose. For hours, sometimes days, the crew fought simply to keep the ship upright. The pumps clanked endlessly, throwing seawater overboard. The men's hands bled from rope burns. Sleep was impossible. Food was impossible. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ended. The wind softened, the waves flattened, and the ship drifted in eerie calm. After every storm, silence felt sacred. Men spoke softly, as if afraid of waking something. They looked at each other with relief, with exhaustion, with the strange, wordless understanding that only those who have faced the sea can share. They also cleaned because the ship demanded it. The decks were scrubbed, the sails mended, and the cargo resecured. The sea might forgive mistakes, but it never forgot them. The long thought of home, between storms, between watches, between endless chores, men thought of home, not in grand ways, but in details. The smell of bread baking, the weight of a child on one's shoulders, the sound of church bells. Letters were rare. A sailor might write one before leaving port, trusting it to a fellow mariner or a friendly clerk. Delivery could take months or years. When a ship arrived at Calcutta or Kingston, the first stop was often the post office, not for money, but for words. Home became a collection of small, imagined scenes. The longer a voyage lasted, the more idealized those images became. Yet, most sailors knew they would never return permanently. They belonged to the sea now, bound to its rhythm. The thought was both comforting and lonely. Port calls and colonial shores. Each destination was both an ending and a beginning. In Calcutta, the air was thick with humidity and the smell of spice. Dock workers, native labourers, known as lascars, moved cargo under the supervision of British officers. In the Caribbean, sugar refineries steamed beside the docks, filling the air with the scent of molasses. In Canton, ships anchored outside the city's walls, forbidden from entering, trading through interpreters and brokers. The sailors saw little of these places. Their world was the harbour, taverns, shipyards, warehouses. Yet even these glimpses shaped their understanding of empire. They saw the faces of those who loaded their ships, who harvested their cargo. They saw wealth flowing in one direction and labor in another. They were not philosophers, but some could feel the imbalance. The quiet routine of trade concealed a deeper tension, one that would, in time, reshape the world. When the ship set sail again, the men returned to their duties, as before. The ropes, the watches, the bells. The same circle continued, but something subtle had changed. The longer they stayed at sea, the more they understood that the ocean was not just a route, it was a condition of life, a place between things, and yet containing everything. The quiet sea had its own logic, its own gravity. It held them in a timeless loop of duty, labor, and survival. And somewhere in that endless repetition, a new question began to rise, soft as the tide, but impossible to ignore. By the time a voyage had stretched into its 8th or 9th month, the men aboard a merchant ship lived in a state of suspended time. Days no longer seemed separate from nights, nor weeks from months. The sea erased boundaries. It was always the same surface, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, but always eternal. In this final stage of the journey, life became both simplest and most profound. The routines had hardened into instinct. The fear of death had dulled into acceptance. Every man knew the ship by touch and sound. The way the deck creaked underfoot at a certain swell, the subtle whistle in the rigging before a shift. In wind, they were no longer passengers of the sea, nor quite its masters. They were part of it, like the barnacles on the hull, or the gulls that followed in the ship's wake. The floating community. Over long months, the ship became not just a workplace, but a community, fragile, temporary, and deeply interdependent. Friendships formed in odd ways. A man who lent his tobacco during a storm might be remembered for life. A shared joke in the galley could outlast mutinies and gales. Disputes, too, were inevitable. Accusations of theft, arguments over rank or religion, occasional bursts of violence. Yet isolation bred tolerance. There was nowhere else to go. A quarrel could not be walked away from. It had to be lived with. The sea, indifferent and unending, made all grudges small. Some ships carried musicians, fiddlers, or pipe players, who provided rare moments of cheer. On Sunday evenings, the men gathered on deck to sing or dance. The music was rough, improvised, and often melancholy. It rose into the night air, mingling with the sound of the waves. When the weather was kind, the captain might allow extra time for washing clothes, shaving, or repairing shoes. These small mercies felt enormous. Clean linen, or a pipe of tobacco, could make a man feel human again. Disease, death, and the sea's indifference. No matter how skilled the crew or fortunate the voyage, illness remained the ship's constant shadow. Scurvy was only one danger. Fevers, dysentery, and infections claimed men slowly and silently. Without doctors, the burden of care fell to the carpenter or the cook, who doubled as the ship's surgeon. Medicine consisted of vinegar, rum, or leeches. When a man died, the ceremony was brief but solemn. The body was sewn into canvas, a weight placed at the feet, and the last stitch passed through the nose to ensure he was truly gone. The crew assembled on deck as the captain read from the Bible. We therefore commit his body to the deep, to be turned into corruption, looking for the resurrection of the body when the sea shall give up her dead. Then, with a soft thud, the body slid into the water. It vanished instantly, swallowed by the grey expanse. Afterward, the men returned to work. There was nothing else to do. The sea did not pause for mourning. Death, like everything else at sea, became part of the routine, a grim punctuation in the endless sentence of the voyage. Arrival, trade, and the machinery of empire. Eventually, land appeared again, not as a dream this time, but as fact. The ship might anchor off Bombay, Lisbon, Kingston, or Cape Town. The names changed, but the process did not. At each port, the same sequence unfolded: unloading, inspection, reloading, negotiation. Customs officers came aboard to check papers. Dock labourers shouted in foreign languages as goods were hoisted out of the hold. The captain went ashore to settle accounts with the local agents, while the clerk, his hands stained, with ink recorded every barrel and crate. This was the true work of empire, the patient arithmetic of trade. No banners, no glory, just figures in ledgers and the groan of winches. The profits made in these transactions sustained entire nations. The sailors saw little of that wealth. Their pay was small, their comforts few, their labour invisible. Yet without them, nothing moved. Each crate of sugar bound for Bristol, each bale of cotton sent to Manchester, each cask of rum sold in London. Every item had passed through their hands. The prosperity of the age was built on their quiet endurance. Return to the home port homecoming was both joyous and strange. When a ship approached the Thames or the Mersey after months abroad, the crew crowded the rails to watch the coastline emerge. The green hills, the smell of land, the distant sound of bells, it all seemed almost unreal. But disembarking brought its own disillusionment. The men were paid off, one by one, at the counting house. Wages were docked for lost tools, damaged gear, or medical costs. The remaining coins went quickly spent on food, drink, or brief pleasures. Within a week, many found themselves on the docks again, looking for another berth. The sea offered steady employment when nothing else did. The rhythm of departure began again, as natural and inevitable as the tide. Some sailors kept journals or letters. Most left no record at all. Their names appeared only in ship manifests and wage books entries in a vast bureaucratic ocean of paper, as silent as the waters they once crossed. The slow decline of the age. By the early 19th century, the world of the merchant sailor was beginning to change. Steam power crept into the harbours, first as tugboats, then as full-sized cargo vessels. The great age of sail was nearing its twilight. For the men who had spent their lives in canvas and rope, the change was unsettling. Steam meant less labour, less skill, and fewer crew. It also meant less mystery. The sea, once governed by wind and will, was becoming predictable. The merchant ships of the old style continued to sail for decades more, but their voyages grew shorter, their purpose smaller. They became relics of a time when distance itself felt infinite. The sea as memory. Years later, an old sailor might sit in a harbour tavern and stare out toward the horizon. He would remember the feel of wet rope, the creak of the deck beneath his feet, the sound of rain on the sails. He would not remember dates, nor the precise ports he visited. What lingered instead were sensations: the smell of tar, the cold of dawn watch, the rhythm of the waves. The sea did not lend itself to stories. It erased them. And yet, through the silent labour of these men, the modern world was built. Every shipment of tea, every bolt of cloth, every letter that crossed the ocean depended on their constancy. They were the invisible pulse of history, never heroes, rarely remembered, but essential, all in the same. Reflections in still water. Standing on a modern dock, it is easy to forget them. The sea today seems cleaner, quieter, less alive. Cargo moves in containers now, lifted by cranes, tracked by satellites. The journey that once took months takes weeks. The sailors who once steered by stars are replaced by screens. But beneath the surface, nothing has changed. The ocean still moves by its own logic, timeless, vast, indifferent, and somewhere within it lingers the echo of those long voyages, the creak of rigging, the murmur of prayer, the sigh of the wind through canvas. The men who lived their lives between horizons may be gone, but the world they helped connect remains. Every cup of coffee, every bale of fabric, every object shipped across water still carries the memory of their endurance. The quiet sea, after all, was never really quiet. It was filled with the hum of human effort, the whisper of history in motion, and if you stand long enough at the shore, listening to the faint hiss of the waves, you might still hear it, the sound of patience crossing time. Imagine walking into a medieval monastery around the year 1200. The air is cool and dry, carrying the faint scent of wax, parchment, and old stone. Sunlight filters through narrow arched windows, illuminating motes of dust that drift lazily above the floor. Outside, the monastery gardens are quiet, save for the occasional crow or the distant toll of the bell. Inside, silence reigns, not the silence of emptiness, but a disciplined, purposeful quiet. This is the scriptorium, the heart of a monastery's intellectual life. Here, monks devote their days to copying manuscripts, illuminating letters, and recording the wisdom of centuries. Every stroke of ink, every careful adjustment of a quill, is an act of devotion. The monastery depends on this labor, not for profit or fame, but for memory itself. Scriptoria were not uniform. Some were vast halls with long tables stretching to the walls, designed to accommodate dozens of scribes. Others were smaller, claustrophobic chambers lit by single windows. Yet, all shared a common purpose: to preserve knowledge. At the center of this endeavor is the scribe, a monk who has spent years learning not only to read and write, but to internalize the rhythms and forms of letters. Penmanship is both craft and ritual. A single misstroke could alter the meaning of a sacred text or a historical record. Precision is paramount. The hierarchy of the scriptorium life. In the scriptorium is ordered by hierarchy as rigid as any medieval cathedral. At the top is the librarian or prior, who oversees the collection and distribution of manuscripts. He decides which texts need copying, which require correction, and which will be stored for future reference. Beneath him are the experienced scribes, men who have mastered the tools of the trade. They correct errors, instruct novices, and handle the most important manuscripts. Their writing is precise, careful, and almost uniform. So much so that it becomes difficult to distinguish one hand from another. The novices or younger monks occupy the lower tier. They are apprentices, learning the rhythm of the quill and the discipline of the day. Their tasks include ruling lines on blank pages, preparing ink, and scraping away mistakes with a small knife called a penknife or scraper. Errors are unforgiving, and repetition is endless. Even the slightest deviation is noted, not with harsh punishment, but with the quiet expectation of correction. The scriptorium operates like a clock. Each monk, each stroke of ink, a cog in the greater mechanism of memory preservation. The daily rhythm, the schedule in a scriptorium, is unyielding. Monks rise early, sometimes before dawn, to participate in prayers and mass. By mid-morning, they gather at long tables, quills poised, ready to work. A typical day involves hours of continuous writing. The hands and fingers ache from holding the quill, yet fatigue is countered by the ritual repetition. Ink is carefully mixed from oak galls, iron salts, and water, producing a dark, durable liquid. The parchment, often made from stretched and treated animal skins, is smooth but unforgiving. One mistake cannot simply be erased. The scribe must be both patient and relentless. Lines are ruled with a faint pencil-like mark or lead, serving as guides for lettering. Initial letters are drafted in pencil before being inked, sometimes later decorated with colored pigments. Meals are brief, taken in silence, often cold and modest. Lunch might consist of bread, cheese, and vegetables. Monks rarely speak while eating, not from disdain, but to maintain the contemplative rhythm of the day. Even recreation is limited. walking in the cloister gardens, tending to simple chores, or occasional chanting, always in service of focus. The tools of the trade. Every object in a scriptorium serves a purpose. Quills are cut to perfection, with points shaped and split to hold just enough ink. A scribe may carry several, as one can wear down in minutes of continuous writing. Inkwells are carefully arranged. Ink must be replenished regularly. Too little, and letters falter. Too much, and blotting occurs. Parchment must be treated and prepared in advance. Smooth, taut surfaces are necessary for legibility. Rulers, compasses, and templates help maintain alignment and spacing. Pigments and gold leaf allow for illumination, adding color and hierarchy to letters and margins. Every task requires attentiveness. Preparing materials can take hours, and errors are costly. A smudge of ink, a folded corner, or a torn page can render a manuscript useless. The process is repetitive, slow, and monotonous. Yet within this monotony lies a form of meditation. Each stroke of the quill reinforces focus. Each line of text affirms the continuity of knowledge. Illumination and symbolism. Some manuscripts are more than text. They are works of art. Illuminated letters, intricate borders, and miniature illustrations bring the written word to life. Monks who specialize in illumination often spend weeks on a single page. Pigments come from rare and expensive materials. Lapis lazuli for blue, vermilion for red, gold leaf for shimmer. Each color is applied with care, sometimes under magnifying lenses. Errors are painstaking to correct. Often, mistakes require scraping away the surface of the parchment entirely. Illumination is not merely decorative. It guides the reader, emphasizes important passages, and reflects the spiritual significance of the text. Every color, line, and curve has meaning. The scribe's work becomes both functional and devotional. Errors, corrections, and the weight of memory. Despite the discipline, mistakes are inevitable. Ink smears, letters are misformed, lines are skipped. The monk corrects errors using a knife to scrape off the ink carefully, leaving the parchment intact. Margins are used to note corrections or additions. In some manuscripts, one can still see faint traces of previous letters, ghostly evidence of the scribe's labor. The scriptorium is both forgiving and exacting. It demands attention, patience, and humility. The labor itself is a form of prayer, a service to knowledge and to God. Each correction is an act of devotion, a quiet insistence on order in a world that is often chaotic, isolation, and contemplation. The scriptorium is not a social space. Conversation is minimal, often prohibited. The walls absorb sound, and the discipline of silence fosters concentration. Monks move like shadows, their feet barely making a sound on the stone floors. This isolation has its psychological effects. Days blend together. Time becomes measured, not by hours, but by manuscripts and pages. A monk may spend weeks on a single book, immersed in its words, its letters, its symbols. Yet the isolation is also transformative. The repetitive labor cultivates patience, humility, and awareness. The monk becomes attuned to small details: the curve of a letter, the texture of parchment, the weight of the ink in his hand. Life in the scriptorium is quiet, slow, and exacting. The unfinished work. Not every manuscript sees completion. Pages are abandoned due to illness, reassignment, or the death of the scribe. Some books remain partially written for decades, waiting for a hand skilled enough to finish them. This imperfection is a reminder. Even in the careful world of a monastery, time is fleeting, and human effort is fragile. The scriptorium preserves knowledge, but it also records absence, incompletion, and labor interrupted. And yet, Every stroke of ink leaves its mark, even if the work is never finished. The scriptorium is a world of silence, repetition, and devotion. It is a place where time slows, and the mind finds focus in the rhythm of work. Outside, the monastery gardens grow, and the world changes. Inside, a single quill moves across a blank page, bridging centuries of knowledge. By the late morning, the scriptorium hums with a quiet intensity. There is no music, no chatter, only the soft scratching of quills and the occasional turning of pages. The light through the high windows shifts slowly, marking the passage of time in patterns across the long wooden tables. The monks' faces are illuminated intermittently, glinting briefly as their eyes move across lines of ink. Life here is a study in endurance. Each stroke of the quill is deliberate. Each line of text demands attention. Mistakes are not tolerated lightly, and yet the monotony is both punishing and meditative. The rhythm of writing, the scrape of the knife on parchment, the refill of ink, all of it becomes a meditation on the persistence of order in a world defined by transience. The scribe's physical burden. Writing in a medieval scriptorium is not an intellectual exercise alone. It is physically demanding. Quills must be held at precise angles, pressure applied evenly to avoid splattering ink. Hands cramp, shoulders ache, and eyes strain under dim light. Monks often develop calluses on their fingers from constant handling of quills and parchment. Ink stains are nearly impossible to avoid, leaving a scribe's hands permanently blackened at the tips. Pages are thick and resistant. Pulling the pen too lightly results in faint letters, too heavy, and the ink spreads into illegible blobs. The very act of preparing materials is labor-intensive. Parchment must be cut, scraped, and polished. Ink is mixed in precise proportions, often from recipes kept secret within a single monastery. Even a small error in preparation can ruin a manuscript. Every step is a test of patience and precision. The mental discipline of repetition. For a monk, the repetition is a kind of mental training. A novice learns early that the mind must remain alert despite monotony. One lapse in concentration can lead to a miscopied word, a misaligned column, or a flawed illustration. Yet there is also a rhythm to the labor. The act of writing becomes almost mechanical, freeing the mind for contemplation. Some monks meditate on the words themselves, reflecting on their meaning. Others use the repetition to organize thoughts, to plan sermons, or to think abstractly. In this way, the scriptorium is not just a place for preserving knowledge, it is a place for shaping the mind. Discipline becomes habit. Patience becomes second nature. The hours fold into one another until the day seems both impossibly long and impossibly short. Errors and the art of correction. Even the most skilled scribe cannot avoid mistakes entirely. When errors occur, correction is both practical and ritualistic. Small mistakes are scraped off with a knife. Larger ones require rewriting whole sections. Margins are filled with notes